Hello. Welcome to States of Splendor Podcast number 9. The subject of today's podcast is micro and macro splendor. We often expect to find splendor or look for splendor in things such as the Taj Mahal or a Ferrari or even a cup of delicious Blue Mountain coffee. However, splendor is nevertheless existent in the extremes in often overlooked areas, such as the infinitely small and the infinitely large things in life. So it's a bit like a spectrum. You have the infinitely small things in life, the infinitely large things in life, and in the middle, the things in which you conventionally expect to find splendor, and in which splendor is even sometimes showcased. Now, splendor in the infinitely small things and in the infinitely large things tend to be natural splendor that exudes without any effort, that is already present, but that depends on the eye of the beholder. Because as we know, splendor is dependent on the perception of the beholder, on the eye of the beholder, at a variable rate of perhaps 50%. So when one brings one's attention to these often overlooked extremes of the micro world and the macro world, we often find limitless splendor, as splendor is to a varying degree in most phenomena in life. The infinitely small things in life, splendor manifested through the infinitely small things in life, could be, for example, this rock here that I personally brought back from the Arctic in Nunavik. I find personally that maybe somebody that would be walking on the street would not see it, but to me, there's some micro splendor exuding from this rock. That's an example of splendor in the small things in life. And right on the other end of the scale, there's splendor in the infinitely large. So that would be looking at the moon or the night sky or an aurora borealis. But those are things that are splendor in the infinitely large. And in between, well, you have things that tend to be of the perfect size for individual or group use, human use. What we'll find out today is a lot of the global culture is in fact made up of microsplendor. Local phenomena are the ones that actually make up the global phenomena. In the microsplendor, we find the source of the macro splendor. In our search for splendor in unexpected places today, we are grateful for the participation of Photo Runner, a Belgian photographer who has graciously allowed us to showcase some pieces of his work. And his work is quite varied, but many times focuses on splendor that can be found in desolate places, in ruins and abandoned places. And there's definitely quite interesting perspective to be found in Photo Runner's work. So once again, we thank very much Photo Runner for his help today. It reminds me of the work of a certain architect that did a memoir about abandoned buildings or buildings that were ravaged by war in a certain European country. These buildings, well, of course, if they're ruins, they can't be salvaged, but some can be restored. And in the process of restoration, he brought forth the idea of keeping a certain trace of the war that the building went through. And through that, a negative effect can actually become positive and have a certain cachet and have a certain meaning and actually contribute to a certain unique character of the building and therefore some quotient of splendor. So a big thank you for the participation of Photo Runner. Also today we have the Hindsight Chronicle, which is going to be focusing on a gastronomical phenomenon. We're going back to one of the prized subjects of States of Splendor, which is gastronomy, and explore a phenomenon that is not completely bygone, which will be two phenomena, because last time we said that we had to explore a phenomenon that's not American. So there's going to be one American phenomenon and a non-American phenomenon. Also, we had we have a contribution for the Splendor Show and Tell. Only one, but nevertheless, we are going to showcase it today. It's a quite interesting object. I hope you're going to enjoy today's podcast. So feel free to contribute, especially comments or questions. Those are really appreciated because they are the main fuel that keeps the passion going here. And as well, if you'd like to contribute monetarily, that would help us to physically be able to continue this craft, in which many hours of work goes into. So regardless of if you're alone and you're going to start to eat now, or if you're about to go to sleep and looking for an interesting subject to stimulate your intellect while going to sleep, I hope you're going to enjoy this podcast. And don't forget, it's also a visual podcast, so all the photographs are relevant to the podcast. So sit back and relax, enjoy this podcast. Let's start this podcast once more and enjoy. Bye-bye. Hello, how are you? Welcome to the S.O.S. Podcast number 9. Micro and macro. Inside and outside. Inside and outside what? Inside and outside ourselves. The yin-yang is an important symbol. It has strong spiritual, symbolical, and educational purposes. I should not here explain to you what it is, other than simply resuming how it represents all phenomena and encompasses the unity of all forces, even opposing, thus translating the great paradox of life, day and night, good and evil, positive and negative, masculine and feminine, inside and outside, black and white, active and resting. Today's subject explores the notion of splendor through its manifestations in the microcosm and the macrocosm. This phenomenon can be analyzed through multiple perspectives. However, if we take the one most common to us humans, we can quickly come across concepts that most aptly describe this phenomenon: the global and local. Think global, act local, or so one saying goes. In many minds, the global comes to the expense of the local, and the local remains only as an expense to the global. However, this is not the case. The two are actually the same subject matter, examined at different scales, or at different stages of development. Now let's have a look at splendor through the microcosm. For this, I will bring 2 books to your attention. Both these books are written about splendor to be found in the small things in life. As a side note, it's interesting to take notice of the fact that 3 generations before us, authors were almost considered as much as we today consider pop music stars. Today, we still esteem authors, but not as much, and it's extremely rare that an author of the current generation equals the stature of that of the great authors of bygone eras. It's rare to encounter the making of a literary classic nowadays. This was somewhat of the subject of the Stuff of Legends, number 6 S.O.S. Podcast. Even if this is partly due to the fact that classics need time to be defined as classics, nevertheless there are quite a few examples of true pearls to be found in today's literature. So, as I was saying, I will bring 2 books that deal with splendor in the microcosm to your attention, and the first one can definitely be praised as a classic, even if it's relatively recent within the context of literature, of course. It was something that was written right before the year 2000 in 1998. This said book is titled The Small Pleasures of Life. It was written by the author Philippe Delerme in 1998 and is already considered by many to be a classic in its unique genre. The subject of this book definitely focuses on the splendor to be found in the microcosm. The original title of The Small Pleasures of Life by Philippe Delerme translates roughly as The First Swig of Beer and Other Minuscule Pleasures. Minuscule pleasures. is exactly what we're talking about. This refers to the microcosm. Although pleasure itself is not splendor, it's often found in its vicinity, so the subject of this book is virtually spot on. The splendor to be found in the small-scale phenomena, in the microcosm, so to speak, is the material of this book. The first swig of beer is in fact one of the very short chapters of this book. The book itself is written with the emotion and poetic stance that makes it very near to prose. Each chapter examines the splendor to be found within often overlooked aspects and objects in daily life. The first swig of beer refers to the uncomparable quench that the first gulp of a beer, any beer, gives to its thirsty recipient. None as wonderful, none as significant, none other as filled with motion. In another small chapter of this book, so pardon me, I won't be able to read verbatim from the book for obvious copyright reasons. The same is said in another chapter of this book for the shine of one of the sun's rays on the surface of the box of pastries bought one Sunday morning while quietly walking back home, appreciating the glow of the sidewalk and the knowledge of bringing home what makes life special, as if it was the last one, or even seen from the perspective of afterlife. I remember that when I was small, I once stopped and looked in the waste paper basket, and I looked at the pack of Chiclets gum. I had just thrown the empty cardboard package in the garbage and felt a little subtle sadness at the fact that it was to be discarded. This was not because of environmental concerns, as I was too young to understand or know anything about that. It was much rather because it was beautiful. It was a shiny, colorful, and straight-edged box, and once housed delicious gum, and now its life was over. Even if it potentially continued to be shiny and beautiful, I found that phenomenon was kind of sad, even at 5. What a beautiful pack of chiclets that small box was. That was one of my first glances at splendor in the small things, in the infinitely small, in the microcosm. Splendor is indeed accessible to all. We're all equal in front of true, authentic splendor, in the sense also that, in theory, it's accessible to all, save a few exceptions. Not only are the most great splendors of the macrocosm accessible to many, like scenery, vistas, mountains, and the night sky, it varies with the territories, as there are many states of the splendor. Likewise, there is much abundance of splendor to be found in the microcosm. It's a question of perspective. Some small quotient of splendor is accessible to anybody if you look in the microcosm. In the small things, one is able to access a whole new world of untapped potential splendor. It's not a question of lowering one's standard to stand in artificial awe in front of anything less than authentic splendor. It's much rather a state of sensing the avenues of splendor in the everyday environment and harvesting it. The second book I said I would bring to your attention is a book that I purposely never read before, not out of lack of wanting to read it. I didn't read this book, I only read a review of it summarizing its content. Seeing that this author was onto a quite authentic, specific endeavor, I immediately chose not to read his interesting books, not wanting to be too much influenced by his material, in order to maintain a true and authentic process during the construction of the states of splendor. This was done in order to ensure the genuine character of new content produced. So this book's subject was also, like the small pleasures of life, very close to the notion of splendor in the small things, microsplendor. This book is titled The Book of Awesome,
and it was written by a Torontonian called Neil Pasricha in 2010. I had come upon it in 2010 while doing research for the States of Splendor French language magazine's radio show in Quebec City. Before being on the radio waves of Montreal, States of Splendor, or EDS in French, was a Quebec City broadcast. So I came upon this book, and its subject was quite explicitly splendor in the small things in life. I only remember 2 examples of such splendor that was detailed in his book. Those 2 examples were enough to tell me that it was good stuff. Here are those 2 examples. One is the wonder of the smell that fills up a place when a cinnamon bun pastry shop freshly baked a batch of cinnamon buns. Indeed, such a thought is wonderful, if ever you've lived it before. It's wonderful like the Paulo Conte song goes. The other example, coming from the Book of Awesome, is the joy that fills up one that puts on a pair of underwear that just came out from the dryer. There is indeed some splendor there as well. We all search for a comfortable and abundant life. Splendor in the microcosm, when it's authentic, is where one can plunge one's metaphysical bucket into the well of unique splendor and truly enrich one's life. So regardless of somebody's financial status, splendor is always accessible. We tend to access it wherever we are, so people who are more fortunate will access their immediate environment. However, in almost any environment, save like terrible exceptions, there is always one glimmer of hope or a small glimmer of splendor that is accessible. If we're not in a particularly fortunate location, we can always look in the microcosm and find an infinite source of splendor. Thus, that's why I talk about the metaphysical bucket. It's like a well that you can plunge the bucket into and come out with the waters of unique splendor, even if it's a small portion of it. This can actually truly enrich one's life. What splendor is around you right now? That's a good question. There's always more than we suspect. This is an exercise that helps us recognize and truly appreciate the essence of the finer things in life. It's not a question of dwelling on superficial materiality and the sensory pleasures in the way that a gemologist, for example, would. It's much more comparable to perceiving the presence of true splendor where it may have been overlooked. Splendor has many forms, many states, yet all of its manifestation harbor its common signature. This signature is much like the golden number. However, it's not objective, nor measurable. It's a certain je ne sais quoi, beyond usual sensory perception. It's often in part based on intellectual reflection. It's often a change in perspective that permits this appreciation. Much like the cliché image where there are people in a museum looking at a painting, then stepping back to get a better picture. You can get the bigger picture this way, by stepping back. Yet also, some will step forward and will stare closer into the painting, focusing on some detail that slowly reveals its magnificence. One may have noticed this phenomenon in the child that finds elaborate games to play with the wrapping paper and boxes of the gifts of the objects that they were given, sometimes having more fun doing so than while playing with an expensive gift itself. Capacity for perceiving splendor in the small things in life is related to our capacity to keep a part of our childhood imagination and playfulness. Splendor is thus expressed at all scales, going both into the infinitely great and the infinitely small. The splendor at both of these ends tends to be accessible to all, and is often very easy to harvest, so to speak. On the larger scale, both the splendor of a scenic vista and that of a countryside night sky are there for all fortunate enough to be within its vicinity. On the micro scale, there is the beauty of your oft-overlooked keychain piece or that subtle aroma of that freshly infused tea evaporation, of which the vapor timidly reaches the senses. It is between these two ends that we find the splendor that is adjusted to our own scale and use, and if it's extremely adjusted, it's adjusted to our own personal individual tastes. In the middle of the scale, according to the point of view of the observer, one finds phenomena more and more fit and intended for specific use, adjusted use. This is where the idea of luxury comes into play. This is also where the idea of custom-made products exist, which are kind of related to the luxury world. So the more the splendor in question is incarnated in the extremes, infinitely small and infinitely large, generally the lower their cost, although not necessarily their value. The more they exist at a scale adjusted to the observer, the more they tend to have utility, desirability, and thus a higher cost, but not necessarily value. So at the micro and macro scales, splendor is democratized, fair, abundant, and accessible. In the middle of the scale, closest to the level of the observer, splendor tends to be exclusive and necessitates more effort to access. Most human lives oscillate between various points on this scale, as even to the most fortunate, splendor in the infinitely small and infinitely large is absolutely conducive to a good quality of life and is a kind of base matrix in which to evolve. Let's go into one example of refreshing aesthetic splendor that was expressed through an element of the small things in life. Of course, each and every one of us have our own references, heavily influenced by childhood and adolescence, and respond differently to the same phenomena. Splendor is thus subjective. Splendor is translated in matter as a sentence can be translated into many languages. Each of us has a language in which splendor best speaks to us. Many times, however, as humans, we can find common ground in this respect. I will therefore share with you this small spark of aesthetic splendor that crossed my path the other day, and we will thus give the tone to today's Splendor Show and Tell. Things of the smaller and larger scales. For those joining us for the first time, Splendor Show and Tell is a segment we do now on every podcast. This is where viewers and listeners like you submit an object that they have in their environment, or an object of theirs that has a little element of splendor in it. It doesn't have to be an expensive or wonderful object, but it shouldn't be either simply something that just has a sentimental value. It should be something that in which we can appreciate the splendor, that what makes it interesting for all of us to see. For some time now, I've been fascinated by the temporal evolution of aesthetics. Common drawings used to illustrate everyday life in the Middle Ages were not the same as in the Art Nouveau period in the 1890s, for example. Similarly, typical drawings and illustrations used for advertising on packaging in the 1940s is drastically different from the aesthetic style of those made in the 1960s and in the 1970s. The 1980s will differ too from those, and so will the 90s aesthetics. As for the 2000s, that being from 2000 to 2009, and the twin teens, that being from 2010 to 2019, it's too early yet to have the necessary perspective to appreciate their specific aesthetic signatures. That should be interesting to see as time goes on. Of course, splendor is a vast subject. To be honest, there is some level of splendor in most phenomena. States of Splendor doesn't, for example, explore the splendor of running a marathon or that of motherhood. States of Splendor's focus is definitely on the manifestation of splendor being unique to a territory. That quotient of splendor is authentic, unique, rare, and takes great endeavors to make and protect. It's important to specify here that when we speak of splendor in the small things or in the microcosm, we don't mean, of course, physically small objects. A diamond, for example, is a very small object physically, but it's obviously related to the very, very adjusted Splendor in the middle scale, one that's curated specifically for one person. It's often it's always a luxury item. We're not talking about the physical dimension of objects. We're just talking about the small things in life and the large things in life. Now, for this Splendor Show and Tell, it was originally my intention to present to you a matchbox from my parents' collection of 70s and 80s matchboxes. Very interesting matchboxes coming from places all over the world. Unfortunately, I was not able to locate the collection. It's interesting how today, almost no companies offer matchboxes as promotional objects. Hotels and airline companies, restaurants and garages have all stopped doing so. Therefore, matchboxes with company designs on them are rare and high in value. Only in some countries do some hotels still offer their own matchboxes to their guests in smoking rooms. Interesting side note, one of the most valuables or rare matchboxes come from a doubly rare source, the Concorde. If you remember, there used to be this supersonic passenger plane that was made by a joint British and French venture. At the time, smoking was still an option on planes, and thus British Airways and Air France had their own matchboxes for their guests. Today, these are doubly exceptional. Smoking is not an option in flights, and the Concorde itself doesn't even exist anymore. So the one that is the holder of one of the Concorde matchboxes has a really, really rare and interesting object. It used to be an object that was a simple commodity, but now, with all the perspective of time, it's an object that emanates quite some splendor. Today, such objects are quite rare. Many have become virtual, increasing the rarity and value of real books, real pictures, real CD albums or vinyl albums, DVDs, baseball cards, concert tickets, written postcards. All these collectible potential mementos have been replaced by virtual, unpalpable information. It is thus a challenge nowadays to find 3D objects that come to have symbolic value. An effort must be made to find new markers in our increasingly digital society. One such standard upon which we can count to find manifestations of splendor in everyday life is the website. The website isn't a physical object, but all of them aim to symbolize a certain home for certain ideas and/or products. It's a fertile ground indeed for harvesting microsplendor. Considering that many of them offer video, they are much like four-dimensional objects, or four-dimensional object marketplaces. In them, splendor can be found to varying degrees. One such website I recently came across definitely is a study of the phenomenon of splendor that exists almost untapped in the world of everyday life. This said site is a quite popular one, How to Make Everything. Andy George pilots this very significant project. Many of you probably have heard of this before. Everything started with a constraint, as many great creative initiatives start. Andy George wanted to make himself a chicken sandwich. What splendor lurks in a chicken sandwich, you might ask? Well, Andy George will help us discover. He set to create an entire chicken sandwich. No effort was to be spared. Everything had to be made from scratch, or gathered naturally using only primary resources. Andy filmed the process and made a documentary film that was to become a TV series, and then the How to Make Everything team that we know today. To make this now famous simple chicken sandwich, Andy grew the lettuce, tomatoes, wheat, and cucumbers needed for the sandwich, gathered honey from hives, killed the chicken and prepared it, went to the sea to get salt water and boil it to make salt. He harvested his wheat, ground his wheat, made the flour, the bread, everything from A to Z. The pickle, the mayonnaise, everything. The whole process took 6 months. You can click on a link to a video made about it in the description below. In the end, Andy simply thought that the sandwich wasn't bad, But ultimately, that simple chicken sandwich, when you think about it, it's quite obvious that in this sandwich, knowing all the work that went into it, the complexity of the tasks necessary to accomplish the endeavor that is a chicken sandwich, actually is an object filled with splendor. So there you have it. Even in a simple object like a chicken sandwich, when you gaze into the microscale, exudes true splendor. Rich is the one who can tap into it. Andy, in How to Make Everything, went on to do the same exercise with other objects of daily modern life. To name just a few, he did, from scratch, an entire formal suit. He also did a t-shirt from scratch, growing the cotton, the dyeing plants, making a loom from scratch with his excellent team. He also made a cup of coffee from scratch. Yes, there lives a sizable splendor in your morning cup of coffee. He made some cosmetics, he made a bar of chocolate, an actual football, a microscope, a toothbrush and toothpaste, a book, and even a promising work in progress, a picture. Although he has not yet succeeded in the making of his first clean selfie from scratch, it sure makes us appreciate the marvel that is intrinsic to each and every picture around us. The wonder that the lens, the precise measurements, the manipulation of the light is mind-blowing. Which brings us to our next item, Photo Runner. This man from Belgium is the Jean-Claude Van Damme of harvesting splendor in unlikely sources surrounding him through the grand art of photography. Through the magic of photography, he's already working and producing splices of splendor. But what makes me bring Photo Runner's work to your attention is that his entire work is devoted to hunting, gathering, and trapping splendor in overlooked areas. When I say overlooked, I really mean overlooked and forgotten, sometimes neglected and thrown away. Photo Runner captures unseen splendor in nature morte. Vestiges, relics, ruins, and things abandoned, where one will see things to be discarded. He sees the splendor of the object in ruin, holding on through time. It's a mystery to me how he manages to find such a wondrous variety of relics. Abandoned cars, trains, houses, castles, offices, an amazing hunting board impossible to enumerate here. Through Photo Runner's work, we realize that splendor is often revealed through the right perspective, the right lens, the right understanding and timing. Take a few moments to appreciate, for those who are watching this podcast on our website, on DTube or on YouTube, these magnificent pictures taken by Photo Runner. Also, check in the link below in the description, a link to Photo Runner's Facebook page. So as we see, impalpable things such as a website can also be vectors of splendor. In today's world, many objects once familiar have almost disappeared. Telephone booths, think of the Doctor Who series, and how the British telephone booth are emblematic, even more so now that they're gone. CDs, DVDs, both almost have disappeared, yet all do not necessarily have splendor in a manifest way. The phone with a cord is an example of a thing of the past, yet does not quite retain a special quality or function, and having recently been replaced by very similar objects, does not particularly exude splendor. In today's very rapidly changing environment, fueled by computing power, finding standards upon which fragments of splendor are reflected in daily objects is a challenge. No more baseball cards, no more comics in the bazooka gum, no more cigarette pack cards, even though those stopped existing in the beginning of the 20th century. No more matchbox art. No more sugar packet art, even though there are many exceptions. Thus, to find such daily objects that still harbor a customized artistic expression is a challenge. I can think of two examples in the world of 2020 which incarnate this function. These objects that cover and protect mobile phones have recently started to be customizable. People can now choose from innumerable styles and decorations, or even designs or pictures printed on them. They thus become objects with a certain relatively unique character, and thus acquire a certain subtle splendor. One needs only to look at the gem-studded mobile phone cases that many stars use to take their selfies. When removed from context, these objects, these mobile phone cases, actually are quite beautiful. Artisan jewelers' work is part of what constitutes it. Those objects will be museum pieces when their owners retire. Another item that can sometimes be of the sort and potentially collected that wasn't that common 20 years ago is hotel card keys. Today, many of these objects harbor artwork on it, but often is limited to logo and straightforward information. However, some hotels have started to feature more interesting artwork, precisely for that reason. Here on the screen, for those watching this podcast on statesofsplendor.com, YouTube or DTube or Daily Motion, this is a hotel card for the West Inn in Los Angeles. It looks good and is a good candidate for collectible material. Its look, however, is one that's not specific to the actual hotel, but more to the chain itself. Now, here is one for the Sofitel in Montreal. This one is more customized as it has mention of the specific hotel and the specific city, but has a much more sober artwork. Both could be collectible, as in 20 years they'll be very cool to look at, as witnesses of their time and place. Many companies have started to pick up on this notion. Romeo's Dry Gin Company, to name one, casts limited edition of its gin bottles featuring artwork from a local artist, integrating the aesthetics of the place of production as well as their own artistic flair. These bottles are produced in very small lots, so they will definitely be collectible items in the future. That's the kind of ingenuity that is taking place these days. Now, to slowly conclude this 9th SOS podcast, let us focus a little on the grand scheme of things and splendor in the macro scale. The sky is there for most to admire, although not of vital importance. When we look at the sky or the moon, it offers us solace through the transfer of some soothing splendor. In one's life, it ends up having a significant influence. Other than visual grandeur, splendor in the macro scale can also manifest itself through culture, as when we contemplate history or civilizations. This is probably why, for me, going through an encyclopedia is a reflection on the macro scale of the world's knowledge. Especially if you have the luxury of having a real three-dimensional encyclopedia, a physical one in a book form. Such a wonder to contemplate such an object, and even more to consult it. We should have a Splendor Show and Tell exclusively devoted to books in the future. So notice to everyone listening, if you have a rare or interesting book in your possession, it would really make a beautiful and perfect contestant on the Splendor Show and Tell. So this is the last of the more philosophical of the SOS podcasts. The SOS podcasts number 3 to number 9 will have been the philosophical series that was didactically important to this show. The next podcasts will be more focused on various examples of people, products, stories, and the such that incarnate splendor through authenticity.
Here's a simple vinyl record. Vinyl records are very much collected by art and music aficionados. They're also collected by DJs, of course. This is because, upon its first play, a vinyl record plays with an absolutely perfect sound, very pleasing to the ear. And vinyl albums are also increasingly collected for their value as an art object, as much effort is often put into the cover, photo, and inside artwork and text. This is an object and phenomenon which is increasingly rare. With the advent of streaming and digital storage, it is thus possible today to more deeply appreciate the artistic value of a vinyl album. See it as an aesthetic product, an aesthetic object, filled with its good quotient of splendor. If you do have such an object, often we say, oh yeah, I do have this object. It's good to know that I have it, But do make the effort to take it out and hold it, to admire it. You may say to yourself, oh yes, that object. I know I have it. I don't need to actually go to it and hold it. I remember it. Well, do indeed go to it and palp it with your hands. It's not a question of sensual materialism. It's all about living the memory. Now is the time for the Splendor Show and Tell. Yes, I'm happy to announce that we actually had a contribution from a viewer. So we have now, as you can see before you on screen, a tortoiseshell. Yes, a turtle shell, or tortoiseshell, as they're sometimes known. Although tortoiseshell refers probably to the material that has been worked. So this tortoiseshell has been sent graciously to us by Georgie from Almaty, which is in Kazakhstan. So this turtle, we have no information, unfortunately, about the turtle. We don't know what species it is or what it is, but it's a small turtle that was apparently found more than 15 years ago, and it's a collectible item. Now, of course, this turtle is difficult to value, but it's something that you can actually find sometimes in some shops, and some antique dealers sometimes have some old turtle shells. Now this is apparently a small turtle shell. This is a quite interesting subject because it brings to mind a whole tradition that is completely bygone. So it could have been part of the Hindsight chronicle as well. What I'm referring to is tortoiseshell is a tradition of making a fantastically interesting material out of turtle shells. And much like the ivory worker that made objects out of ivory, that is almost a completely bygone tradition, but nevertheless still subsists in certain parts of the globe. Now, this in front of us is not a hawksbill turtle. The hawksbill turtle is what was used to make tortoiseshell. And tortoiseshell is something that is very beautiful, as you can see, and it was made with the hawksbill sea turtle, and that's a much bigger turtle. This apparently is a sea turtle, but a much smaller one. I don't know if it's a younger one, and unfortunately we have no information about the species. So in any case, a long time ago, the hawksbill sea turtle was used to make tortoiseshell. Now, as this turtle shell exists now today, it could probably be sold on eBay for something like $30, because there's some people that actually look for this. Maybe you could stretch it to $50, I don't know. But depending on the species it is, it has more or less value, and also the fact that it has a few years. It's probably something that can be bought and sold. There is a monetary value to this shell. But tortoiseshell was taking the shell and transforming it into sort of like a gem. So many high-quality crafts used to use tortoise shells for making luxury items and musical instruments. There used to be a quite highly regarded tradition using the tortoise shell as material. In Europe, the tradition of incorporating tortoiseshell into objects was most highly developed in Italy, but it was also practiced in France and Spain and other neighboring countries. So this shell came from the hawksbill turtle, although there sometimes was some work done with the green sea turtle. So in doing tortoiseshell, there's much work that goes into it. The shell has to be boiled using a certain temperature, a certain time period, and
it has to be done while preserving its color as much as possible. And then you have to separate the scutella from the shell and take the resulting material and apply it with great heat and pressure. And then you can also join pieces of tortoise shell, and you can mold them into shape using heat and mostly pressure and moisture. And it keeps its shape upon cooling and hardening, and the material becomes semi-transparent. It was intensely polished, and then the result is a noble material that sometimes looks like precious stones. Actually looks like amber. It also has a very pleasant and warm feel to the touch. Now, many people think of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the ninja armor made of turtle shell, but this is not the same thing. We're talking about material that has been completely transformed. We don't really have any objects today, except for certain plastics, that look in the same way, and then they don't have the same feel to the touch. To give you an example, because it's quite hard to find these objects today, certain people still have them in their household, and they're obviously in certain museums. But if you go to Milano, at the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II, in the main square, you can find Louis Vuitton. Yes, that's the way it's pronounced. An LV, if you like. And in this magnificent store, you can find a travel chest. All of the accessories has a cover or a handle made out of tortoiseshell. Now, when I went there, I remember asking the salesman what the material was. Is it amber? And he replied that no, it's not amber, it's authentic tortoise shell. Now, the process keeps some color and some transparency, and the produced tortoise shell results in an amber-like, and also the texture is a bit like amber as well. And so it's quite astonishing because I had never seen anything like it apart from amber. This tradition is unfortunately almost bygone. It doesn't exist today. There's also the Beko tradition in Japan, mostly in Nagasaki. The Nagasaki Beko is very well known because during the Edo period in Japan, in the 17th century, there was a kind of closing down, an isolation of the country, during which an exquisite refinement of this Japanese aesthetics developed. And that's when the Nagasaki Beko tradition developed. There was a lot of trade at that. Well, actually, no, there was not a lot of trade, but at Nagasaki there was limited trade that was available. And so this craft developed using imported tortoise shell that was often hawksbill turtles. Now, even as early as the Asuka period, you have such crafts, like between 538 and 710. There were such tortoise shell crafts that were imported from abroad. But it's in the 17th century, because trade partially allowed in some tortoise shell, the Beko tradition developed using turtle mostly from China and Indonesia. So the craft started in 1603 and developed. It evolved and it refined itself, and they reached the technique for melding together different pieces of tortoise shell in 1688. So because they could join pieces, the tortoise shell shields were melded together using new techniques, and they were able to make more significant and sophisticated pieces. They started to make bigger pieces, such as large fans, or, for example, they would make eyeglass frames, hairpins, guitar picks, knife handles, drawer handles, things like this. Now, the Beko tradition may have been influenced by the Italian tortoise shell tradition. They developed their own unique aesthetic to it, and what makes the unique technique of the Beko finished product is that they actually carve the tortoise shell, and that's what makes the really distinctive Beko technique that's recognizable as typically from Nagasaki. Now, in Europe, what made it recognizable, for example, in France, was the piqué technique. The piqué technique was taking gold thread and incorporating it inside the actual tortoiseshell material. Technique made it that while it was hot, you could put the metal thread, and while it would cool down, the material would kind of close down on the thread, and the thread wouldn't move after that. So they would do designs with incrustations of gold thread, and it was quite impressive. You can look at some of the famous furniture designer, the king's furniture designer Bull. He made some astonishing pieces using fantastic marqueterie woods and tortoiseshell, making really, really impressive furniture pieces that are now in the Louvre or in different museums throughout the world and in different households. So there's a lot of manipulation in doing tortoiseshell. There's a shaping. You have to be careful with the moisture rate and the temperature, and the pressure that you apply has to be just right. And finally, there's the polishing, which is really crucial to the finish of the material. So now in 1992, there was the Washington Convention, and usually in Japan they used about 30 tons of hawksbill turtle shells every year. The Washington Convention rendered sea turtle shell trade illegal, so they were not able to import any of this hawksbill turtle anymore. So that's quite sad. These artisans almost all died, but there's a few that are still alive because they have some ways of finding some turtle shell. For example, they had tried to do a reduced durable production by importing only 4 tons a year, really making only small production just to keep it for its anthropological value, And it was rejected, unfortunately. Then there's Cuba and Indonesia that regularly eat hawksbill turtle. And Cuba has a big surplus of hawksbill shells because they eat them, and they're not just going to throw away the shell. So they were offering to export a little quantity to Japan just for the art of Beko, and it was again rejected at the conference. And then they tried with the green turtle, which is another alternative. These two turtles are used because there's kind of some natural glue inside the shell material. And it was rejected as well, even if Cuba has some as well to spare. But so then there's Indonesia as well that can offer some quantities, but it's impossible to import it. But there's probably some work being done using smaller species of turtles, just as we can see today here. Maybe the edible turtle varieties have some potential in using their shells for keeping the Beko tradition alive. Now, this craft may perhaps survive because at the time in 1688 they found a new technique for joining together pieces of tortoiseshell. Now, the same type of research can go into this subject and try to find a way to use different edible, smaller varieties of turtle. And this is not to start overfishing the turtles, but there's some turtles that are raised for edible purposes that you can find in supermarkets all over Asia. This would actually just be using their shell that would otherwise be wasted. So perhaps you can look at this tortoise that was generously submitted to us by Georgie. That can be perhaps the future of tortoiseshell. You can see this tortoiseshell is more than 15 years old. This shell perhaps represents the small-scale future of tortoiseshell making. It may become a harder craft because there's more joining and more cutting to do, but it's well worth it because it's keeping a valuable tradition alive. And the substance now, tortoiseshell, is now so precious because it actually doesn't exist and can't be made, or only on a very, very small scale. This makes tortoiseshell something on par with ivory, another material that can never be made again into many objects. But sometimes there are other things that appear that nobody thought about. Like, for example, there's a man that we will showcase on a future States of Splendor report that is in Montmagny in Quebec, and he actually discovered another source of ivory that is called the St. Lawrence ivory, or sea ivory. And this is not coming from narwhal tusks or walrus tusks. It's not something that is problematic like this. It's something that's done without killing any animal. It's only a byproduct of some fisheries. And so there is another source of ivory, but this is something we'll get into on a further date. There's also something that this tortoise shell that we see in front of us reminds me is velvet. Yes, some Italian velvets. Well, at the time they were called Venetian velvets that were so costly to make and technically difficult to produce that today nobody can make it. So you're now looking at this tortoise shell, which is witness of a bygone technique. So thank you for this contribution, this magnificent tortoise shell. I hope you hold on to it, Georgie. It's a magnificent memento to have. If you want to sell it, you could probably sell it for a certain amount, but I suggest you hold on to it. Save it for another generation. Now is the time for the Hindsight Chronicle. For those who aren't familiar with the Hindsight Chronicle examines a bygone phenomenon of culture in the world. From now on, we are going to make every Hindsight Chronicle be accompanied by a subject of something that exists currently in our culture. So in the Hindsight Chronicle, we'll have one phenomenon that's completely bygone and another phenomenon that will eventually be in the hindsight rear view mirror, but that still exists today and that may survive in the future or may not. And so today we have two subjects, one which is still existing today, which has to do with a New York tradition. It's a New York gastronomical tradition. We've had a few comments that have said that they would like us to speak more about gastronomy, as that is like one of the main drivers of States of Splendor and the SOS Podcast. And also some people that told us that they would like us to showcase a phenomenon that is not American, because we've done all of such chronicles centered on many American subjects. So this time we're going to have one subject that's from New York, but another one that is definitely not from the US and not even in the Western world. So our viewers in Indonesia and in other countries, mainly in Asia, can probably be happy to know that today's subject is coming from the continent of Asia. So let's start now with the first subject of the Hindsight Chronicle. And it's a subject, it's the one that still subsists today. So if you go to New York today in 2022, you will still find this tradition is well alive. However, it is only a shadow of what it used to be. And it once was really, really blooming industry, or a blooming market at least, in a certain sector of Brooklyn, New York. Today, it exists, but it's very rare. So the ones that still exist have to be encouraged. And so, therefore, I will encourage you to, if you are in New York ever, to encourage this tradition. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about pickles. Pickles. Such a delicious tradition, isn't it? So pickles obviously can refer to many different marinated lacto-fermented products. We have pickled eggs, pickled beets, pickled pork tongues. We have pickled many things. However, when you say the common American usage for pickle, it's usually referring to a pickled cucumber. And they don't use any cucumber. They use a kind of shorter variety of pickle. And in French it's called cornichon. It's kind of like a pygmy cucumber. Now there's many traditions of pickled cucumbers, and they can be found throughout the world. And let's see, one of the first ones would be, it's not the first one historically, it's just the first one in the list, is the Vietnamese style pickle. Now this is a much smaller pickle coming as well from pygmy, or very miniature cucumber, but it's much shorter and lighter, and it's the one that's the most popular in France actually. It's what's known as the French pickle actually. Now these pickles are pickled with vinegar, so the pickling process is completely different, and this is not the pickle that we're talking about tonight. No, this is not the pickle you are looking for today. We're looking not for pickles done with vinegar, but pickles coming from another tradition that's coming from the northeastern European tradition, Russian, Polish, etc. And there's also another tradition, before I go into what we're looking for today, is the Iranian/Turkish pickle, or Caucasian pickle. Now they also have quite an astonishing tradition of pickling, and if you go to markets you can find whole stalls full of only pickled stuff, mainly cucumbers, but also a lot of different vegetables and other edible products that are completely pickled. So it's a long-standing tradition over there, and I could make quite a subject talking about this Turkish tradition of pickling, or the Caucasian Iranian tradition of pickling. It's quite extensive and quite sophisticated, but today we're looking for the New York pickle. The New York pickle delves or takes its source in the Russian Jewish tradition. It's coming not from the same marination as the French pickle, which is marinated in vinegar, but it's coming from the malosol tradition. And malosol refers to things that are lacto-fermented in brine. So these pickles came with the first Jewish immigrants that came to New York in the, the first ones were quite early, but there was a big wave in the 19th century, and that's when the New York pickle took its peculiar shape. It was diffused worldwide. So the malosol tradition does not use vinegar in its lacto-fermentation. It has a brine made out of brining salt, and what they do is, because brine itself is not as tasty or savory as certain vinegars, they add different spices to the brine. And in this case, the New York pickle is kind of transmitting the Russian Jewish tradition, which is mainly dill is added to the brine, but also loads of garlic, and in some cases fennel is added, whereas the French pickle is with vinegar and sometimes mustard seeds. But in the malosol tradition, they don't use vinegar. Vinegar was actually quite expensive sometimes, being that you have to start with wine to do that type of vinegar. But in the malosol tradition, the brine is added with different spices and herbs, and generations and generations of Jewish immigrants in New York made these pickles. They even had a district in New York. Now, if you remember, if you've ever listened to the SOS Podcast number 3, Harnessing the Power of Time, you'll see that lacto-fermentation is one of the big subjects of that podcast, which is one of my favorites anyways. And lacto-fermentation is the art of harnessing the power of time, because things that will be put in a certain solution will actually gain value, nutritional value, and gastronomical value with time. The lacto-fermentation will actually transform these products into other things. And so such a tradition evolved in New York in the 19th century, so much that there was a district that was at the corner of the Essex and Ludlow streets. It was commonly known as the Pickle District. And at the time, there were, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there were maybe 80 pickle shops in that district. Essex and Ludlow today, if you go, now there's a few that remain, but they're really almost all gone. And if you're looking to encourage this tradition, because this tradition has been transmitted worldwide. Now, in Montreal, we've always been in competition with New York, because the Jewish population of Montreal made different products that were a bit analogous to the products that were made by the same community in New York, such as, for example, bagels. Some people like New York bagels, but everybody knows that Montreal bagels are way better. The same thing goes for pastrami. New York swears by their pastrami and Katz Deli and everything. And I'm sure it's good, but, Montreal smoked meat has the edge, and always had, actually. So I hope to hear from New Yorkers that have that beg to differ. But in any case, in Montreal, there was never any pickle tradition. So the other pickles that went with the Montreal smoked meat came from New York, or they were similar companies that were operated in Montreal or in Quebec City that made pickles and made it in the same way, or roughly the same way. And the same thing goes for London. Wherever you can find a smoked meat place, you're going to find some pickles. And the original ones, if you're looking for the absolute original, it's from New York. And one of them still subsists today. It's called Gus Pickles. Gus Pickles opened in 1920 and still exists today. And it was founded in the authentic district of Pickles, the pickle district of Essex and Ludlow Streets. And it's Isidore Gus that worked at many pickle shops, because there were many pickle shops in that district. And eventually he went on to start his own company. And his own company kind of became a star, was the survivor of natural selection. It's now operated by Andrew Leibovitz, and it's available there, and it's made in relatively small handmade batches. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to reach Mr. Leibovitz because he was on vacation, so we don't have permission to show you pictures of the place, but I encourage you to look it up. And actually, there is good news, because these authentic New York pickles, these authentic New York kosher pickles, ship worldwide. So if you go to guspickles.com, Gus, GUSSPICKLES.com, you're going to be able to have these authentic, and they're really delicious. They're crispy pickles, and there's never sugar added, because let it be known that adding sugar is kind of cheating in that process. Although some people like adding sugar in the mixture, so that's their prerogative. But I think the authentic New York pickle does not. And so you can find these authentic, delicious, cracking pickles that crack under the tooth when you bite. You go to guspickles.com, and this isn't an advertising, it's just that it's the one authentic New York pickle joint that still subsists today. So let's encourage them and give a hearty salute to this business that's open since 1920. The New York pickle, the stuff of legends. And now we go to the bygone phenomenon of the Hindsight Chronicle. And what did we find for you today? It's indeed the stuff of legends that unfortunately departed. Now, this subject today only recently departed, so it just entered the domain of legend and the domain of the Hindsight Chronicle. So as I was saying previously, this subject is not an American one. It's a subject that is actually not from the Western world. It's a very pertinent subject because this business was known worldwide and really enjoyed an incredible reputation during its existence. So I bring to you Jumbo Kingdom from Hong Kong in China. This restaurant was quite legendary. It was a Cantonese-style restaurant, and it was a huge restaurant. It was immense. It had 4 floors, actually. So the first part of this restaurant was called the Tai Pak restaurant, and that opened in 1952. It could seat up to 800 guests, and it became really successful. And so it was so successful that there had to be an addition that was made. And the addition that was made was more than double the size of the original Tai Pak. Now, the thing that is special and unique about Jumbo Kingdom is that they're actually a boat. It's actually a floating it's not a floating city, but it almost is, because it's really jumbo. It's the biggest floating restaurant in the world. It became successful in the 60s and 70s, and actually in the beginning of the 70s it was so successful that they had to create a second boat, a second floating restaurant. And so that's when they did the jumbo restaurant, and there was a fire that killed, unfortunately, a lot of people, maybe between 30 and 40 people in 1971. And so they had to be reconstructed, and finally it was operational and started in 1976. And that's when they had the whole jumbo compound rolling along. So there was the Thai Pak restaurant and this new jumbo restaurant that was constructed, along with a floating kitchen, which was a huge kitchen as well. And it could accommodate up to 2,300 guests in 4,200 square meters. It was there was even a 6th-floor pagoda in the restaurant. It didn't look as if it was floating, but when you came along, you saw that it was really a floating restaurant, and it was quite. It was almost a sci-fi element to it, even though the actual restaurant had an aesthetic that was Imperial Chinese, and it was very beautiful. So much that it was very, very famous worldwide. It was always featured in many photographies and ads, and focuses on Hong Kong. And unfortunately, what happened was in March 2020, there was kind of like a world problem. I don't know if you remember, but there was a lockdown, and well, Jumbo Kingdom never recovered. They just closed and they never reopened. It's very sad. There was a kind of an initiative by the Hong Kong authorities that wanted to preserve it as being patrimonial culture of Hong Kong and reopen it. But in March 2021, they decided not to reactivate it. So it closed in March 2020. It was very known. It was not the greatest gastronomical restaurant of Hong Kong, but nevertheless, it was still a quality restaurant, and it had very good seafood and the Cantonese style, of course. And Cantonese dim sum, and they served seafood. They served incredible lobster, and it was maybe not the most gastronomical restaurant in Hong Kong, but they had many different things. Apparently, they had a very good suckling pig that was much appreciated by many famous people, such as, for example, Jackie Chan, or the notorious amateur of Hong Kong, which is Jean-Claude Van Damme. And there was also a quite famous movie that was filmed there in the 90s that was called The God of Cookery. I've never seen that movie. It's with Stephen Chow. It's a kind of Iron Chef parody. It's quite funny. There was even a James Bond that had a scene that was in the Jumbo Kingdom. It was such a humongous restaurant, and as you can see on the pictures, the decor is fantastic. It actually looks like a solid hotel that's on solid ground. There's many floors, and there's a tea room. It's quite impressive. And so that's why the Man with the Golden Gun, James Bond movie, had a scene over there. And even Bruce Lee went to the original Thai Pak. This was before the actual Jumbo Kingdom, but the first boat, which was the Thai Pak, and was still operational within the Jumbo Kingdom compound. The Thai Pak was featured in Enter the Dragon, which is quite a classic. It's actually the last movie of Bruce Lee, Lee Xiaolong, the very respected legend. It was featured as well in many video games. There was The Amazing Race that featured it, and many different TV shows. It was really, really worldwide. It was part of world culture, actually, in its own way. And not on a small scale, because it was quite a big scale. As you can see on the pictures, we're talking about a humongous place. Even as a restaurant, it's a mammoth mastodon. So finally, after the March 2020 closure, they tried to open it, but they decided not to in 2021, and they sold the Jumbo Kingdom to Cambodia. And the company that was towing because it is a floating restaurant, so it's kind of like a boat, so you can drive the restaurant all the way to another country. So they wanted to drive it to Cambodia, but in a kind of strange turn of events, it capsized by a company that had previously towed such humongous boats and had them capsize as well. So it's quite there's some questions that happened over there. But who knows? So what happens is, near the Paracel Islands, the Jumbo Kingdom simply capsized and is now underwater. Although there have been some reports that it's been recovered, but unconfirmed reports. And this happened quite recently. It capsized only on the 19th of June 2022. The Paracel Islands are kind of contested islands between Vietnam and China. So it's only a memory now. And they had a tea shop, a banquet hall, a roof deck, 2 kitchens. It was a huge thing. And unfortunately, it's gone. Although there is the original Thai Pack restaurant that still exists, so you can still visit that. And there's a second Thai Pack restaurant that was constructed approximately at the same time, and it was sent to the Guangxi province in mainland China. Although it's not as big as the Jumbo, there is still some flavor of that, and you can still take a look at the Thai Pack restaurant. But the Jumbo Kingdom Mammoth Restaurant is now gone, part of the Hindsight chronicle. So long live the memory of this mighty restaurant, the Jumbo Kingdom. This thus concludes the SOS Podcast number 9, Micro and Macro Splendor. If you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please contact info@statesofsplendor.com. A recent email comment suggested that I find another term for this production other than a podcast. I am at a loss as to what I could call this show other than a radio show or a podcast. If you, the listener, have a suggestion for that, feel free to post it in the comments below or by email at info@statesofsplendor.com. Please consider contributing to our project through Patreon at the address on the screen. Each of your contributions help us fulfill our mission and makes all the difference. The private philosophy club that was mentioned in the SOS podcast number 8 has still not started, as there hasn't yet been any participant that manifested through email or private message to participate. We thus await this to start the private philosophy club. We are, however, happy to have started to receive contributions for the States of Splendor show and tell. So to present an object you feel has a quotient of splendor on the SOS podcast, please do so by email at, once again, info@statesofsplendor.com. Also, if you have suggestions for the Hindsight Chronicle or any other suggestions, please feel free to contact us at info@statesofsplendor.com. So keep an eye on statesofsplendor.com for more articles and videos by our contributors. I hope everybody's pulling through and doing well. See you again next time for the next SOS podcast, number 10. See you next time. Bye-bye.